This is a funny guitar. And this is not actually the first time it's been documented in the guitarosphere. Those of you who follow Jake Wildwood's blog, which is a long-standing insight into the doings of a Vermont-based fix-it guy and seller of guitars. I think he's also on YouTube. I'll try and remember to post a link in the video description. This is a 1964 Epiphone Serenader, the FT85. This is from a time when Gibsons and Epiphones were made together in the same factory, very similar in terms of quality. And so this is very much like a B2512, which is, a smaller body 12-string guitar. However, it's not a 12-string anymore, it's a 9-string, which is pretty funky, man. Big Joe Williams, Mississippi bluesman, played 9 strings. He put those together himself. He made them out of harmonies and Ks, and I think he had a Gibson one as well. But a 9-string is not a very common variant. To add to the story, it was retopped in 1984 by a fellow named Dale Fenn in Middlebury, Vermont. Dale apparently built instruments as well, and Jake documented a square neck dobro he built in 2002, which was serial number 23. Now this thing being from 20 years previous, one can only speculate. Why did he change it to a 9-string? That it was retopped is not a surprise. Those mid-60s small body 12 strings have tops that frequently collapse. Almost every playable example now has a bridge doctor in it, basically. Here's a shot of the interior. Chonky braces. Some innovative stuff going on behind the bridge plate. And then there's this. That must have been a bad, bad day. What are the chances Mr. Fenn had a fret ruler and he read the wrong side, and used 25.5-inch scale? Yes, that is exactly what happened. Ouch. This is a 24 3/4-inch scale, or what Gibson called 24 3/4. They used a number of scales over the years, labeled as 24 3/4. It's a long story. Anyway, this is actually 24 5/8. There's some ghosting on the ebony bridge here where he plugged the holes that correspond with these in the top. I guess he decided that double strings in one hole would be cleaner and easier at some point. Despite the replaced soundboard, there is some sinkage going on in front of the bridge, and the bridge itself is kind of bowed slightly. Maybe enough to actually lower the radius of the strings, not unlike what we saw in that Fender Wildwood acoustic last month. Playing it, I'm hearing a bit of a buzz on the middle strings, and when I measure them, the action that is, they are quite a bit lower than the outside strings, which is something we can deal with because we're going to be making a new saddle as part of the work we're going to do. The player would like to string this in unison rather than octave for the G strings, so we'll have to intonate that. We're going to make a new saddle, and we're also going to put a K&K pickup in here. The saddle exposure in this case is pretty good. It's around 1/8 of an inch. The saddle itself is far too narrow for the slot. And I checked out the intonation, and it seems to be in the right location. It's not too bad. I'm told that it's too shallow. So we're going to have to deepen the slot and make it more regular. So there's this shim in the slot. The saddle itself is quite short, and of course it can bend along with the soundboard and the bridge. So producing a taller saddle should give us more stiffness and resist that dipping effect. Actually, I think some of that dipping effect has been carved directly into the bridge. It's been lowered at the front to gain a bit more saddle exposure, I imagine. But the top is, without string tension, pretty close to flat, which is good. And that carving is how we end up with a saddle slot that's only about 1.5 millimeters deep on the treble side, going up to about 2 on the bass. I'd much rather see like 4.5 or 5. In terms of width, around 110 thousandths. Yeah, I'm going to widen that slightly to 1/8 of an inch, 125 thousandths. There was a fellow last year who kept haranguing me to draw him a plan of this device, And I was like, I've shown it a dozen times. You get the picture, right? And he's like, no, you should draw it for me. And the answer to that one is, and I know this is kind of a venomous attitude on my part, sort of a trade guild mentality or something, but if you want to get into fixing guitars, not only should you be able to draw your own plan, figure it out and come up with something, that's what you should want to do, rather than take someone else's design. Because, you know, you might make something better. It's basic to the personality type required. Because there are no shortcuts in this. You don't want to be the guy who buys every single StewMac tool they've ever made and display them on your pegboard before you've done a setup, right? I will say one thing. When you design this jig, you'll tell yourself that it's wide enough to accommodate any bridge you're likely to find, and then one day someone's going to show up with an Echo Ranger 12 or B25 12 like this, and you're going to go back to the drawing board, because it doesn't matter how big you make it, there's always a bigger bridge out there. Routing the slot proceeds as it usually does. I kind of drill to depth at the end of the slot and then take successive light passes to create the channel. I need to sand and clean the surface of the bridge plate in preparation for gluing in the pickup. Thanks to the viewers who suggested a tip using a step bit as a good pilot for drilling this kind of hole. I made a snug-fitting saddle blank and radiused it. The previous saddle was a 16-inch radius, which is a little too flat, flatter than the fingerboard. This one is now 12 inches to match the Gibson standard. I installed the jack and the strap button. Gave it a little twist with the soft jaw pliers. Then I glued in the pickup dots using some gel-type super glue. On my index finger is a piece of a rubber glove with some wax on the tip of the finger to keep me from gluing myself to the guitar. I'm trying to decide how to string this thing. Measuring the ones it came with is sort of frustrating because they don't seem to align well with any single commercial set. I don't think you want to just scavenge from a 12-string pack, because you would still need to replace the one G string. And to be honest, I'm not sure there's really enough punch in the single bass strings in an extra light 12 set. The top strings on here were, I think, 10s. I think we can go a little bit heavier. So I've decided that a double set of these 11 to 52s should probably work okay. You're going to end up with 3 extra bass strings, but at least they're usable gauges. Special thank you to the 31 of you who contacted me to tell me about that Gibson factory tour video from 1967, which they just released. Yeah, it's very evocative. I genuinely love industrial training films or like exposition films from those days. And that one utilizes a trope that you see a lot in early craft-based documentaries. I think the directors all really wanted to work in film noir because you get the dimmest factory workstation scenes you'll ever see. They love to do that. You know, they turn out all the lights except one, the one bright spotlight. In the beginning, there's this fellow who's sighting a neck, and he's measuring the action in abject darkness. There's no way he can see the increments on the ruler. And there's another scene where there's a worker who's running a bandsaw with the spotlight directly in his eyes. So, you know, muscle memory was the only thing that kept his fingers on that day. I'm setting the intonation points here using a bent piece of string on the top of this flat saddle. On a 12 string, usually the intonation points on each pair of strings, they're going to deviate from the slant of the saddle because they're the same length and don't need extra compensation on the higher string. So the intonation line is more or less perpendicular to the center line of the guitar for the upper strings. Alright, I think I'm ready to say farewell to this one. What do I think of it? It's an interesting experiment. It is a dedicated 9-string. You could, of course, get the same effect by retaining all of the pins and the tuners and just stringing it with 9 strings. And then maybe in the future, if someone wanted to use it for a 12-string, they could do that. However, to each their own. Here's an Eastman mandolin, which suffered an injury. Eastman is kind of recognized for being among the top level of Chinese instrument manufacturers. It was started in the early 90s in Beijing by a flautist, actually. It wasn't a string player, named King Ni. And I think he began as a distributor who decided he really wanted to have a company that made stuff instead. And he wanted to pattern said company after the German instrument-making tradition of the 19th century. The early manufacturing that was still all focused on hand skills. So they began making high-end student violins, and that led to guitars and other stringed instruments as well. You have to remember that there is an unbroken tradition of fine woodworking in China, particularly carving. And there's also a stringed instrument culture, too, that's ancient and as developed and refined as anything you'd encounter in the West. You add that to the growing interest in Western violin-based classical music and this huge domestic market that didn't really have a bunch of high-quality instruments kicking around for the serious student, and it was a very astute move. They're doing well. I've worked on a number of Eastmans, and they're always very nicely made. This is a classic break for the F-style mandolin. The design of the headstock is it's pure Orville Gibson, right? He had a very fanciful streak in him. And there are F2s and F3s from, say, 1902, when he was still in charge of the company, that are completely realized versions of this curly-Q madness. The other place they're prone to break is over here on this side. This round part will just pop right off because the direction of the grain is vertical, and we're relying on a very short length of it here to hold it all together. The lightest little bump can do it sometimes. Responsible, forward-thinking builders will try and reinforce this area by inlaying a plug with the grain running in the opposite direction here before applying the face veneer over top, and that can help. So somebody stuck this together again in a way that is more evident than it probably needs to be. So I'll try and touch this up some. And again, I say this a lot. I'm not a master of retouching or disguising. I don't usually aim to make things completely disappear. That can take a whole lot of time and effort, and on some innate level, I kind of rebel at the thought of that. The 3-foot rule is good enough for me. Is the repair not smooth? Does it draw excessive attention to itself? If yes, then maybe we do a little work on it. So, with that in mind, let's see if we can make this recede into the background a bit more. We'll pull some tuners off to get better access and get a better look at the area of the repair. You can see raw wood and some other kind of adhesive. I'm going to lightly sand that to get rid of any kind of atmospheric gunk that's on the top of it. I'll be painting over this with transparent colored materials, and I think it's a good idea to block those from penetrating whatever this material is. I suspect this might even be epoxy putty. It has that sort of look to it, which isn't a bad thing. It's okay. I can work with that. I was using shellac for this. There's one mitigating factor that adds a serious level of difficulty, and that is this instrument has a satin finish. All of the touch-up materials I use naturally dry to a high gloss. And there can be a shift in the color that appears only after the satin top coat is put on. So the flattening agents in the finish refract light in a different way. Some of the light waves are attenuated or diffused as they travel through and bounce back. So, if you look at the face of this headstock, this does not look like a pure black. in natural light. It's much grayer because of this phenomenon. These are Color FX liquid dye concentrates, much like trans tint. These I get from Wood Essence Distributing in Saskatchewan, and they have pretty good density of color. To start off with, I'm trying to match the overall tone that appears in the background here, this neutral reddish brown. So I use that to fill in the missing color, after which I use a slightly more concentrated, darker tone to try and bridge the character of the wood on both sides of the damage. So, this isn't like fine art restoration where we're only filling in the missing material. The overlap is kind of what lets our eye pass over the area and not hang up on the discrepancy. So we can invent grain or figure or convolutions in the wood, anything we need to make this kind of disappear. The texture is slightly different right now because working with the shellac and brushing it, it ends up being uneven. I'm going to have to sand this down lightly and probably come back and do more touch-up over top before putting on the finish coats. Just building up layers, letting it dry for a few minutes. The shellac flashes off pretty quickly. It doesn't dry or cure completely, but it gets hard enough that I can work over top of it. And yeah, we'll just keep going. The face of the headstock is going to be very difficult to make truly disappear. It's this continuous flat gray-black color again. So close is as good as we can hope for. I'm using a drawing ink for this, like an India ink, thinned down slightly. I'm going to build it up in layers, see if we can kind of get it in the same family of gray. The pebbly surface you see will be sanded down flat before the top coats go on. I'm going to be using Deft Satin Nitro in a can. And I'll be using very lightly misted coats because that's the final surface. You can't sand or buff this stuff. The paper towel mask is held above the surface so I don't get a hard line. I've got some strings on and I'm letting them stretch. Mandolin strings often need a bit of a break-in period due to how high the tension is and just the odd stringing on these tail pieces. The loop ends take a while to deform and kind of get comfortable on there. But I was playing it a bit and I noticed that I was digging a big dent into the palm of my hand, because this is another case where the corner of the bridge is super sharp. It might not affect some people depending on how they hold the instrument, but personally I think it could do with a little softening right there on the edge. Much nicer. Well, all right. I think that's a lot better. You wouldn't notice it the first time you picked it up. This dark area here kind of echoes what happens in the short grain area here next to the nut. So, call that good enough.